I pulled into the Kroger parking lot on Morse Road at 7:30 in the morning because Margaret Tibbs, my next-door neighbor from before I moved to the townhouse, had called me the night before and said she thought she saw my son's truck parked in the far corner of the lot. She said she'd driven past twice, and the second time, she saw a little head pop up in the back window. I didn't sleep after that call. I just lay there staring at the ceiling until it was light enough to leave. I almost missed it. The truck was backed into a spot between a recycling bin and a concrete divider, half hidden under a broken light post. Nathan's old gray F-150, the one I helped him buy 11 years ago when he got his first real job. There was a blanket taped over the back passenger window from the inside. I parked 3 spots away and sat for a moment. Then I got out and walked over and knocked on the driver's side window. Nothing for a few seconds. Then the blanket on the back window shifted and a small face appeared. My granddaughter Emma, 7 years old, with her mother's dark hair and her father's eyes, blinking at me like she wasn't sure I was real. Then another face right beside her, Lily. Same eyes, same confused expression. The driver's door opened and my son climbed out. I hadn't seen Nathan in 6 weeks. He'd lost at least 20 pounds. There were circles under his eyes, so dark they looked bruised. He was wearing the same Carhartt jacket I'd given him for Christmas 3 years ago, and it hung off him like it belonged to someone bigger. He looked at me and said, "Dad." That was it. Just Dad. And then he put his face in his hands. I stood there in a Kroger parking lot in Columbus, Ohio, on a Tuesday morning in February, watching my 37-year-old son cry in a way I hadn't seen since he was 9 years old and broke his collarbone falling out of the oak tree in our backyard. I put my hand on the back of his neck, the same way I did then. "How long?" I said. He wiped his face on his sleeve. 19 days. I opened the back door and helped Emma and Lily climb out. They were still in their pajamas. Emma was wearing one sock. They pressed themselves against my legs, and I held on to them, and looked at my son over their heads, and I thought, whoever did this to my family is going to understand what a serious mistake they made. I took them to the IHOP on Carl Road and ordered everything on the kids' menu. Emma and Lily ate like they hadn't had a hot meal in days, which it turned out they hadn't, not a real one. Nathan drank 3 cups of coffee and stared at the table, and I let him alone for a few minutes because I could see he was building up to something. Then he told me everything. He and Diane had been married 9 years. I had never loved that woman the way a man is supposed to love his daughter-in-law, and I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to understand what happened. Diane Mercer came from a family that believed it had a certain standing in this city. Her father, Gary Mercer, had spent 30 years building a real estate business in the northern suburbs, and he treated that business like it was a dynasty. He was the kind of man who remembered every favor he'd ever done for anyone and kept a running tally in his head. Her brother Todd was a mortgage broker who dressed like he was auditioning for a television show about mortgage brokers. They were a family that moved through the world with the absolute confidence of people who had never been seriously inconvenienced. When Nathan married Diane, I gave them my blessing because he loved her and I trusted his judgment. He was a structural engineer, smart and steady, not the kind of man who made reckless decisions. He had built a good life. They bought a 4-bedroom house in Westerville. They had the twins. He got promoted to project lead at his firm. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. What I didn't know, what Nathan only began to understand about 2 years before everything collapsed, was that Diane had been quietly miserable for most of their marriage and had chosen to deal with that misery not by talking to Nathan about it, but by talking to her father about it. Gary Mercer had decided somewhere along the line that his daughter had married beneath herself. Nathan was a good engineer, but he wasn't the kind of man Gary had imagined for her. He wasn't networked. He wasn't in the right rooms. He couldn't do anything for the family in the way Gary understood that word. What Nathan only found out after it was too late was that Diane had started seeing someone else. His name was Preston Hale, and he was a commercial real estate developer, which meant he was exactly the kind of person Gary Mercer wanted his daughter with. The affair had been going on for at least 14 months before Diane made her move. The move was precise. That was the thing that took my breath away when Nathan described it. It wasn't a woman who had fallen out of love. and wanted out of a marriage. It was a campaign. It started 8 months before I found Nathan in that parking lot. Diane began telling people, carefully and selectively, that she was worried about Nathan, that he had a problem, that he had been gambling. She said it to her mother, to her friends, to her colleagues at the school where she worked as an administrator. She built a story, brick by brick, that Nathan Calloway was a man who had been secretly losing money for years, who had emptied savings accounts to cover his debts, who had become volatile when she confronted him. None of it was true. Not a word of it. But Gary Mercer had a friend who was a family court attorney, and that attorney helped Diane file for an emergency protective order on a Thursday afternoon in September, citing fear of physical harm. Nathan came home from work that evening and found a sheriff's deputy in his driveway and a piece of paper telling him he had 2 hours to take what he could carry and leave his house. His house, the house he had made the down payment on with money he saved for 6 years. He was not allowed to return. He was not allowed to contact Diane except through attorneys. A temporary custody order was filed the same week, granting Diane primary custody of Emma and Lily. Nathan was given supervised visitation, 2 sessions per week, 2 hours each, at a family services center on Sunders Road. He went to those visits every single time. He was never late. He brought art supplies for the girls because Emma had started drawing horses that year, and Lily was obsessed with making bracelets. He sat in a supervised room with his daughters and colored horses and made bracelets, and did not once say anything to them about their mother or what was happening. Diane showed up with the girls for 4 weeks. Then she started canceling. A stomach bug, a school conflict. Emma had a cold. Nathan would drive to the family services center and wait in the parking lot for 20 minutes before the coordinator came out to tell him the visit was canceled. This happened 6 times in 8 weeks. He called his attorney each time. His attorney filed motions. The family court system moved at the speed of erosion. Meanwhile, Nathan had been staying in a friend's spare room, then a motel on Bethel Road when the friend's wife ran out of patience. Then the motel money ran out. The joint accounts had been frozen pending the divorce proceedings, and the account Diane claimed in her filing that Nathan had drained was in fact an account he knew nothing about, a separate account she had opened 18 months earlier and moved money into steadily, 23 transfers over 15 months, totaling $61,000. His attorney had found this in discovery, but the process of proving it, of connecting it to fraud rather than routine financial planning, was slow and expensive, and Nathan was running out of money to pay for slow and expensive. Then came the night in late January when Diane's mother called him. Her name was Barbara, and I want to say something about Barbara Mercer because I think she is the most complicated figure in this whole story. She was not a cruel woman. She had always been polite to me, genuinely warm to Nathan in the early years, and I believe she loved Emma and Lily in the uncomplicated way that grandmothers love grandchildren. But she was a woman who had spent 60 years deferring to Gary Mercer, and that kind of long practice makes cowardice feel like loyalty. Barbara called Nathan at 10:30 on a Friday night. She was crying. She said Diane had left that afternoon with Preston and wouldn't be back until Sunday. She said she had the girls, but that her back had gone out and she could barely get off the couch, and she was scared. She said, "Please, Nathan, I can't do this tonight. Please just come and get them." He drove to the Mercer house in Dublin in 22 minutes. Barbara met him at the door. She handed him a bag with some of the girls' clothes and their stuffed animals. Emma was asleep on her feet, and Lily was crying quietly because she didn't understand what was happening. Barbara said, "I'm sorry, Nathan. I'm so sorry." He believed she meant it. He took the girls. He knew it was legally complicated. His attorney had explained the order clearly. Primary custody with Diane, Nathan's access limited to the supervised sessions. Taking the girls without Diane's explicit consent was a violation of the temporary custody order, even if Barbara had asked him to. He knew this. He thought about it for the entire drive back. But he also thought about Emma being asleep on her feet and Lily crying and a 68-year-old woman alone with a bad back who was clearly being used as a babysitter so that her daughter could spend the weekend with the man she'd been betraying her husband with for over a year. He took them to the motel that he could no longer afford. He checked out the next morning and put what was left on his credit card, which was close to its limit. He thought about calling me. He said he thought about it every day for 19 days, and every time he talked himself out of it because he was ashamed, which broke my heart to hear him say, because he had nothing in the world to be ashamed of. He drove to a Kroger parking lot on Morse Road because it was well lit and open 24 hours, and there was a bathroom inside. He bought food from the hot deli counter, and they ate in the truck. He put the girls to bed in the back seat with every blanket he owned. He slept in the front seat. 19 days. I listened to all of this. I did not interrupt. When he finished, I sat quietly for a moment, watching Emma carefully separate her pancake into exactly equal halves, which she had done since she was 3 years old, an act of such profound and ordinary normalcy that it made my throat tighten. Then I said, "Do you still have Barbara's number in your phone?" He looked at me. "Yeah, call her. Tell her the girls are safe and they're with me. Do it now, before she calls Diane. I put some cash on the table. Then we're going to my place. Everyone is going to shower and sleep in a real bed, and tomorrow morning, you and I are going to sit down and figure out exactly what we're dealing with." He stared at me. "Dad, I violated the custody order. If Diane reports it, Diane left her children with an elderly woman who could barely stand up, so she could go away for the weekend with her boyfriend. That is also a fact, and facts have a way of mattering." I stood up. "Call Barbara." He called Barbara. She answered on the second ring. She started crying again, almost immediately. She said she hadn't told Diane. She said she'd been terrified. Nathan said, "Barbara, did you ask me to come get them?" There was a pause. She said yes. He said, "I need you to remember that you asked me." She said, "I know what I did. I know. I took everyone to my house. I made up the guest bedroom for the girls, and they slept for 11 hours. Nathan slept on my couch, and I sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and thought. My name is Frank Calloway, and I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years running a construction and contracting business in Central Ohio. I built that business from a truck and a tool belt to a company with 62 employees. I sold it 3 years ago when my knees decided they'd had enough of job sites, and I sold it for enough that I have not had to worry about money since. I am not a wealthy man by any standard that would impress Gary Mercer, but I have resources, and I have patience, and I have a very clear memory of every piece of advice anyone has ever tried to give me about when to fight and when to walk away. I have never once in my life walked away from anything that mattered. The next morning, I called a family law attorney named Carol Whitfield. I had used her firm 2 years earlier during a contract dispute, and she had impressed me as someone who prepared better than anyone else in the room and never once raised her voice. I explained the situation to her assistant, and Carol called me back within the hour. We met in her office on Polaris Parkway 2 days later, Nathan and I together. Carol listened to everything without taking notes, which I had learned was her habit, and then she asked Nathan a series of questions that were so precise they felt almost surgical. She asked about the accounts, the transfers, the timeline of the protective order, the pattern of missed visitation sessions, the phone call from Barbara. When Nathan finished, she leaned back and said, "The custody violation is a problem, but it's a manageable problem given the circumstances, especially if Barbara Mercer is willing to provide a statement confirming she asked you to take the children. What I'm more interested in is the protective order itself, because everything downstream of that, the custody arrangement, the account freeze, the narrative about your finances, all of it flows from those initial claims Diane made to get that order." She looked at Nathan. "You said she told people you had a gambling problem for months before she filed, and there's no truth to that. I've never gambled in my life. My father can tell you. I'll need more than your father. I'll need financial records going back 3 years, complete banking history, credit reports, everything that shows your actual financial behavior. If she built a false narrative and used it to obtain a legal order, that matters." She paused. "Tell me about Preston Hale." Nathan knew the name, but not much else. Carol said she would have a private investigator establish a documented timeline of the relationship, which was relevant both to the divorce proceedings and to the question of whether Diane had made material misrepresentations to the court. She also said something that I wrote down, because I wanted to remember it exactly. A protective order obtained through fabrication is not just a divorce tactic. Depending on what we find, it could constitute fraud on the court. That changes this from a contested divorce into something considerably more serious for the people who helped construct that story. I looked at Nathan. He was sitting up straighter than he had in weeks. We went to work. Carol's investigator was a former Columbus police detective named Harris, who wore the same blue windbreaker every time I saw him and moved through the world with the absolute absence of urgency that I recognized as the mark of someone who was very good at their job. He found Preston Hale in 4 days. He documented the relationship going back 16 months through cell records, hotel receipts, and the social media activity of Hale's assistant, who had an unfortunate habit of posting background details in her Instagram stories. He established that the relationship had been active and ongoing during the entire period when Diane was telling people Nathan was unstable. The financial investigation took longer and was more revealing. The $61,000 was only the beginning. Carol's forensic accountant found that Diane had also taken out a home equity line of credit against the Westerville house using documents that bore Nathan's signature. Nathan had never signed those documents. He had never applied for that line of credit. He had never known it existed. Someone had forged his signature, and the home equity line had been opened 9 months before the divorce filing, well before any formal legal proceedings, which meant it was not a marital asset dispute. It was fraud. The forensic accountant also found that 6 months before Diane filed the protective order, large transfers had been made from Nathan's personal account to an LLC registered in the name of Todd Mercer, Diane's brother. These were the transfers Diane had used as evidence of Nathan's gambling losses. The transfers had been made from Nathan's account, but Nathan had not made them. Someone with access to his banking credentials, his login, his security questions, had made them. Someone in his house. Someone who knew his passwords. Carol called me when the accountant finished the preliminary report. She said, "Frank, this was not a marriage that fell apart. This was a coordinated plan." I already knew that. I had known it since the morning in the parking lot. But hearing it confirmed by a financial forensic expert and a former police detective gave it a weight that would matter in court. Carol filed an emergency motion to modify the custody arrangement based on newly discovered evidence of fraud and financial misconduct. She filed a separate motion for Nathan to have unsupervised, temporary residential custody pending the full hearing, supported by a declaration from Barbara Mercer confirming that she had asked Nathan to take the children and that Diane had left them in her care for an extended period without consent. Barbara had agreed to provide that declaration. She had come to my house one evening to give it, and she had sat at my kitchen table and signed the paper with her hands shaking, and when she finished, she looked at Nathan and said, "I should have said something sooner. I know that." Nathan told her it was all right. I was not sure it was all right, but I understood why he said it. The morning of the emergency custody hearing, I drove Nathan to the courthouse, and I sat behind him in the gallery. Diane was there with her attorney, a man named Philip, who looked like he spent a lot of time on golf courses and not quite enough time preparing. Gary Mercer sat in the back row in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he looked at me when I sat down with the kind of steady, measuring look that men like him use to signal that they are not concerned. I looked back at him for a long moment, and then I looked away, because I had nothing to prove to Gary Mercer, and I knew it. Carol stood up and spoke for 22 minutes. She was not dramatic about it. She was methodical and specific, and she put documents in front of the judge one at a time like she was laying cards on a table. The forged home equity signature, the account transfers to Todd Mercer's LLC, the documented pattern of Diane canceling visitation sessions, the timeline of the affair, Barbara's declaration, Harris's report. Diane's attorney objected several times. The judge overruled him each time with a brevity that did not suggest she was impressed by the objections. At the end of the hearing, the judge granted Nathan temporary residential custody of Emma and Lily, pending a full evidentiary hearing scheduled for 6 weeks out. She also issued a preservation order on all financial records associated with both parties and referred the forged signature documents to the county prosecutor's office. That last part was not something I had expected, and I watched Gary Mercer's face in that moment, and I saw something move across it that had not been there before. I rented a 3-bedroom house in Worthington 2 days later, furnished. It had a yard with a big maple tree, and Emma said it looked like a good climbing tree, which it was, because I tested it myself. I enrolled the girls in the elementary school 4 blocks away, using the notarized temporary custody order. Their first morning, Emma brought her horse drawings to show her new teacher, and Lily wore every bracelet she owned on her left arm, which came to 14. The full evidentiary hearing took place 6 weeks later and lasted 2 days. Nathan did not have to say much. Carol did most of the talking, and what she had to say was supported by 47 exhibits and 3 expert witnesses, including the forensic accountant, a digital forensics specialist who had analyzed the banking access records, and a handwriting expert who testified that the signature on the home equity application was inconsistent with Nathan's known signature samples in 11 measurable ways. Diane's attorney cross-examined each witness. None of the cross-examinations went well for his client. What came out during those 2 days was this. The plan had been Diane's idea, but Gary Mercer had been its architect. He had introduced Diane to Philip, the attorney, not as a divorce lawyer but as an advisor, 9 months before the protective order was filed. Todd Mercer had set up the LLC specifically to receive the transfers from Nathan's account. The transfers had been made using a device registered to Diane's work email address. The home equity application had been prepared by a notary who turned out to be a longtime business associate of Gary's, a man who was, by the time the hearing happened, already being separately investigated by the county prosecutor. The protective order had been obtained based on written declarations from Diane, from Gary Mercer, and from 2 of Diane's friends who stated they had witnessed Nathan behaving erratically and that Diane had confided in them about his gambling. Carol called one of those friends to the stand and asked her a series of very specific questions about dates and locations of what she claimed to have witnessed. The friend's answers were vague and inconsistent. When Carol put a document in front of her showing that on one of the dates she claimed to have witnessed Nathan's erratic behavior, Nathan had been at a work conference in Cincinnati with 43 colleagues. The friend looked at the document for a long time and then said she might be misremembering the date. The judge's ruling came 3 weeks after the hearing ended. Diane was denied primary custody. Nathan was granted primary residential custody of Emma and Lily. Diane was given supervised visitation, 2 sessions per week, 2 hours each, at the same Family Services Center on Saunders Road, where Nathan had sat waiting in the parking lot 6 times while his visits were canceled. I don't know whether the judge chose that location deliberately. I choose to believe she did. The civil judgment ordered Diane to repay $61,000 in transferred funds, plus the outstanding balance on the fraudulently obtained home equity line, which, with interest, had reached nearly $40,000. The judgment also awarded Nathan attorney's fees, which Carol had structured in a way I did not fully understand, but which resulted in a number that made Philip, Diane's attorney, visibly wince when the judge read it aloud. The criminal referrals were handled separately. I am not going to pretend that process was swift or satisfying in the way that stories are supposed to be satisfying. The law moves slowly, and plea agreements are made for reasons that have nothing to do with what any of the injured parties think is just. What I will say is that Gary Mercer's notary associate pled guilty to document fraud and was disbarred. Todd Mercer entered a plea agreement on charges related to receiving fraudulently transferred funds and was required to repay the full amount plus penalties. Gary Mercer himself was investigated for his role in advising and facilitating the scheme. That process was ongoing as of the last time I spoke to Carol about it, and I have learned to hold those outcomes loosely because the legal system does not exist to make me feel that the scales have been balanced to my exact satisfaction. What I do have is this. I have a house in Worthington with a maple tree in the yard. I eat dinner there 3 nights a week. Nathan has built the girls a small raised bed garden in the backyard, and Emma is growing sunflowers and Lily is growing strawberries, and neither of them is growing what they planted. But that is the nature of gardens and of children. Nathan has gone back to full-time work. He looks like himself again. He looks better than himself, actually. Like a man who went through something terrible and came out the other side with a clearer understanding of what matters. Emma asked me once, about 4 months after all of this, whether I had been scared when I found them in the parking lot. I thought about it honestly. For about 30 seconds, I said. Then I was just mad. She thought about this with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to everything. Mad at Mom? Mad at the situation, I said, which was as close to honest as I could be with a 7-year-old. She nodded like that made sense to her. Then she asked if I wanted to see how tall her sunflowers were. I did. I always do. I want to say something to any man or woman reading this who has been where my son was. I know there are more of you than any of us talks about, men especially, who have been taught since boyhood that asking for help is the same as admitting defeat, who will sit in a parking lot for 19 days rather than pick up the phone. I understand that impulse. I had it myself at points in my life. What I want to tell you is that the shame you feel in that moment is not about you. It is about what was done to you. There is a difference, and it matters. My son thought he had failed. He had not failed. He had been deliberately and systematically dismantled by people who had spent months preparing to do exactly that, and he had still gotten up every single time and shown up to supervise visits with art supplies, and sat in that room for 2 hours making bracelets with his daughters. That is not failure. That is the opposite of failure. What I know is that I am 64 years old, and I have had to learn a few things the hard way. And one of them is this: the people who love you cannot help you if you do not let them know you need it. That is not weakness. That is the whole point of family. I found my son in a parking lot in February. I brought him home. We fixed it together. That is the whole story.